we don't have to start debating Christian scripture for the purposes of this discussion, because actually all of that is precluded in principle right from the start. Analysis shows that any argument based on religion depends upon an unjustified appeal to authority, one which is not actually authoritative. Again, the religious interpretation of some subset of the population does not set the legal and moral standards of our country. If it did, you can imagine what would be the case. A great deal more would be against the law, including perhaps unmarried heterosexual sex, and we would live in a theocracy, which means a tyranny. The religious sphere today, in a country like ours, is private and not state-sanctioned, while marriage and its status are also in the public sphere of law and civil rights, which are state-sanctioned. So this is not just a question of personal morality and private preferences, but public law, equal justice for all, which means, among other things, what is constitutionally protected and established. The marriage is, of course, a public, civil, contractual, and legal matter, as well as a private and a personal commitment. It obviously brings certain kinds of benefits, custodial and parental rights, joint ownership of property, next of kin status, all kinds of advantages that one has in this kind of committed relationship. Now, in moral terms, I was suggesting the question of same-sex marriage must be determined independently of religion, appealing to such considerations as harm, consent, whether people are being treated equally. In political terms, I would say the foundation of our rights is the contemporary framework of constitutional guarantees and protections. Not the Bible, in other words. Constitutional tradition, which is alive and evolving, which is improving over time, which is coming closer to living up to the full meaning of its original principles, that all are equal under law, all are free and equal in rights and dignity. We're trying to live up to those principles. Civil, political, and personal rights do not derive from religion. All persons born or naturalized in the United States have the rights and protections of the constitutional tradition. This was one of the major advances of the Enlightenment. That is, the idea that public morality has to be secular in a civil society. This was the crucial step toward a theory of rights, which could actually hold for all human beings, irrespective of their cultural and religious differences. I'll say a little bit more about secular morality towards the end of my remarks, but before I do, I want to address directly some of the claims that are advanced against same-sex marriage. That is, which attempt to establish what is wrong or bad about it without overt objections. Because not all objections to same-sex marriage have come directly and explicitly from the Bible or religion. Obviously, not all objections come directly that way. So I'll consider 6 different claims here. Claims that I encounter in this discussion, the kinds of things that I see bring for 1 year's conversation. And as I say, I will offer what I take to be some rebuttals, or even in some cases, decisive refutations. But these are necessarily abbreviated versions, oversimplified versions of those claims, and also of those arguments against them. That is, perhaps these claims can be made in a stronger way than the abbreviated form in which I'm giving them, but then so too the rebuttal or the refutation. So let's consider first the claim that marriage has traditionally been defined as being between a man and a woman. That's what one says. Marriage is defined as being between a man and a woman. And I want to say, well, definitions change, as conceptions do, over time. That definition is, at least to some extent, arbitrary, and it should be open to improvement if there is an overriding good reason. And in this case, there is an overriding good reason. We have a clear counterexample. We have married couples who are of the same sex. So I would suggest, in talking about definitions, that we consider what is implied in the definition of a spouse, which captures the idea of a marriage partner without stipulating the sex or gender roles of either spouse. Marriage, if it is indeed defined as a man and a woman, would be a limited concept. But what we are talking about is historically evolving, which is a concept which needs to recognize changes in society and in consciousness. Marriage really is an abstract concept of a relationship And it's no longer tied, as it used to be, to things like children, property, inheritance, the joining of families, or other reasons which used to dictate the nature of the concept. It still has some ties to those, but it is not directly tied to them, nor is it derived from them. So I would say marriage is not defined once and for all as a union of one man and one woman. That too seems to me an arbitrary stipulation, and it certainly does not hold empirically. Empirically, there are polygamous relationships, there are same-sex marriages, so clearly marriage is not just between a man and a woman. It may traditionally have been linked to children, property, inheritance, etc., but today marriage is primarily based upon love and sex and a spousal commitment to life partnership. So along these lines, I was reminded of Plato's Symposium. This is one of his dialogues about love. And it seems to me the speech that Plato gives to Aristophanes in the Symposium offers the first philosophical consideration of the varieties of life partnership based on love and sex. You get this interesting myth there that human beings were originally a whole made out of two halves, and then they were split in half. Well, these pairings that made one whole, some of them were male-male, some of them were female-female, and some of them were male-female. And what the gods did was to cut us all in half. So we were separated from our other half. And so what we end up with then is love as sort of searching for completion by finding your other half, whichever sex either of you may be. Plato was holding out this possibility then that one's life partner and completing other half may be of the same sex or of the opposite sex. So it's not the case then that marriage is necessarily defined as between a man and a woman. It seems to me, though, that the decisive refutation to this claim about tradition, that, well, this is the way we've traditionally understood marriage to be, the really decisive refutation to that is the following. You cannot appeal to past practice and tradition when that practice and tradition have been discriminatory and unjust. It's as simple as that. You cannot appeal to a discriminatory tradition to justify continued discrimination. Tradition itself is not an unerring authority, but only a guideline. And where rights are concerned, past practice and tradition are nearly always wrong, as we find. We look back and we find they have nearly always been on the wrong side of questions of rights. And this goes on until rights are eventually granted to a minority group, which hitherto had suffered unjust discrimination and diminution. Well, history has neither remained static, nor has it moved backwards on questions of rights. Where rights are concerned, groups go in one direction. They go from not having rights and struggling for equal recognition, eventually, we hope, to enjoying those rights and being protected by that equal recognition. This was the case of civil rights, this is the case of women's rights. I see no reason why this is not the case for gay rights, gay and lesbian. Very analogous situation. Okay, well, there's another claim, and this is not one, I must confess, I don't really understand this claim. But it is said that allowing same-sex marriage will cause harm to marriage, heterosexual marriage. I'm glad some of you laughed. There's something ludicrous about that. What I would want to say, my first attempt at rebuttal there would be to say, well, this has never been shown that it would cause any such harm, period. For one, it's never been tried. So we don't know what will happen to heterosexual marriage. But more importantly, what kind of harm are we talking about? What will it do? Will it weaken heterosexual marriage? How? How does that happen? What does that mean? It will somehow cause matrimonial bonds to weaken and break? Why would that happen? No one, to my knowledge, has ever explained or demonstrated how this harm or endangerment is supposed to happen. All the arguments against same-sex marriage, which begin from a claim about the harm that will supposedly result, are basically causal arguments. But there is no causal mechanism, no cause and effect relationship that has been put forward, just speculation and supposition. These are speculative claims. They're not at all obvious, they're not self-evident, they're not grounded in any good empirical evidence or social scientific methodology. So what makes us think it will lead to harm? Why couldn't it be thought of as simply expanding the institution and concept of marriage to encompass and include a greater number of actual committed life partnerships. That is,